French Senate delivered a report on the drugs trade, which concluded that France is swamped by drug dealers. The report also made a number of recommendations on how to tackle the issue. France 24's James Vecina tells us more.
A 6-month investigation, after which the Commission alerts that illegal drugs have flooded French society. Cannabis use is constantly on the rise, while cocaine is now soaring, and legal highs could be next. With an increasing number of different drugs available on the market, authorities are often unable to keep up with their flow via the many transit routes used by gangs in the country.
Not one department, be it customs, police, intelligence officers, or any other service, has confirmed that the means they have today are sufficient to keep up the fight against drugs.
A lack of staff and appropriate technology, as well as loopholes in the country's judicial system, mean that the drugs trade in France generates between 3 and 6 billion euros every year.
These weaknesses show that trafficking isn't taken into consideration as much as it should be. If we'd measured the risk properly, we'd have much better means in France today.
As a result, the Commission recommends that France creates an anti-drugs prosecutor's office, as well as a new agency based on the DEA, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. It's also highlighted corruption in the country and called for better international cooperation. This in an effort to reach the drug lords, who most of the time seek refuge abroad, far from the trafficking that takes place in France.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross now to Thomas Pietschmann, who is the Senior Research Officer at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Drug control and crime prevention, very much the mandate of the UNODC. And yet, as we saw in that report, the situation in France and elsewhere in Europe is getting worse, it would appear. Why is that?
First of all, just to confirm, it's getting worse not only in France, it's getting worse throughout Europe at the moment. We are particularly confronted with a wave of cocaine. Cocaine is flooding Europe in many parts. It has been produced at higher quantities in the Andean region, and much of it is nowadays really coming to Europe. That's the bad news. At the same time, we also have some kind of good news. So perhaps let's speak later about heroin, where actually there seems to be a decline. And other drugs is more stable. But cocaine, it's really a catastrophe. Europe is flooded with cocaine.
So who are the drug kingpins? And just tell us a bit more about what substances are flooding the market and where it's all coming from.
Okay, the market is really being flooded, as I said before, with cocaine. Cocaine is coming from South America, either directly to Europe, either then through other countries in South America, so either directly Colombia or via Brazil and many other countries in South America. And some of it is also coming to West Africa and then from West Africa towards Europe. These are the main, but even we have seen shipments to Eastern Europe, and you've seen shipments to Southeastern Europe, and from Southeastern Europe into the markets of the European Union. So for many parts at the same time, but particularly at the moment we see floods. Once you said France is correct, but also we see Belgium, so Antwerp, really being flooded with cocaine. A lot comes to Rotterdam, and ongoing trafficking continues in Spain.
Okay, I mean, what's changing? I mean, are we seeing any new players amongst the gangs that are out there on the streets selling these substances?
There's not so much of a change, so it's very much the same groups involved. But what we've seen over the years was that trafficking from Colombia towards the United States has become more difficult. It is more problematic to Mexico, and then Mexico crossing the border to the United States. We see that this flow is high, but it's stagnating, and the increase really has been now Europe. Europe has been last 3 years the market, the growing market. The risk normally for drug traffickers are less coming to Europe than they are for North America. It is quite obvious, and so we really see this flooding. And we see, of course, more players. We see not only South Americans, we see people from the Balkan countries involved, and many other groups as well. So it's really, and now also going to Western Africa and then back to Europe. So it's from many areas at the same time. But at the same time, many of these groups already existed. So there's not such as new groups, but what we also see is that some groups are not only trafficking one drug, but in 2 or 3 drugs at the same time.
Okay, so on the one hand, it sounds as though law enforcement is struggling to stay ahead of the drug dealers. And on the other hand, I mean, as you mentioned, Europe is a more attractive market for dealers and for the drug industry as a whole, because the penalties here aren't really that severe. And that's sort of inviting, some might say, people to do business here.
Now, having said about all the problems, we also should see it a little bit of the positive side. On the positive side, we see at the moment the heroin side. Opium production in Afghanistan has declined by 95% in 2023. So at the moment, it is gradually declining the flows of heroin to Europe. We see the first results of this, which is clearly positive. The problem is now, how will the market react? How will people who use such substances react? If they go into treatment, if they go into substitution treatment, into methadone, into buprenorphine, it's fine, it's perfect. So really, we urge governments to have these programs in place. The big problem is and could be if those people switch to other products like fentanyls, like nitazenes. They are highly dangerous products. In the United States, we have seen over the last couple of years a massive increase in the number of people dying from drugs, particularly from fentanyls. And this is a potential danger which could happen in Europe as well. And it's a new kind of drugs emerging. It's the nitazenes. Nitazenes are even stronger than the fentanyl, and they are also already starting to emerge on European markets. So we urge governments to do everything in their capacity to have sufficient programs in place to absorb this in order not to have a new catastrophe due to the lack of heroin on the market.
Do you think it's fair to say that perhaps governments are putting too much emphasis on punishing the dealers and not enough emphasis on punishing the consumers? And were the consumers to be strongly deterred from buying and using drugs, there would be no demand, and that would solve the problem, wouldn't it?
Yes, at the same time, we have to say that Europe has been, I think, far more realistic than some other countries, far more a balanced approach in many European countries. So there is treatment in place. And people, it is far easier in Europe to get access to treatment than in many other parts of the world. So that's the good news. We are just warning that because there's something major happening on the heroin side, that with a new wave of people possibly entering these kind of treatments programs, that they are available, they are made available, and we cannot afford bureaucracy to wait a couple of years, because then it may be too late.
Okay, and just lastly, I want to ask your opinion about, jailing drug dealers, because, in many ways, they're just the lowest hanging fruit. They're not the top of the pyramid. And putting them in prisons obviously fills up the prisons and presumably also provides some sort of a conduit to provide prisoners with drugs, because they'll probably be able to distribute them and they'll know how to get hold of them. So that doesn't seem to be the solution either, does it?
This is clearly a problem. At the same time, so the UNODC, particularly when it comes to users, UNODC is urging governments to provide alternatives, notably treatment for people who use drugs rather than prison. So I think that's very clear. For possession, people should not come to prison. If somebody is a dealer, it's another story. But if somebody is just a user, he shouldn't end up in prison. So that is a policy on the other side. At the same time, UNODC is also against the death penalty. Because this is in many parts actually preventing cooperation among countries, because many countries who do not have the death penalty don't cooperate with countries who have the death penalty. So actually the death penalty is actually helping drug traffickers because it prevents international cooperation. And what is needed is international cooperation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time. But Thomas Pietschmann, Senior Research Officer at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Thank you very much indeed.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get a